Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving straight into um, a really knotty and enduring issue in international relations,
Hmm.
one that our sources indicate is, well, a major preoccupation for Beijing, the matter of Taiwan and China's one China policy.
Right. It's definitely something that causes China real heartburn, as they say.
Why does this grab our attention? Because it sits right at the heart of significant global tensions, a clash of perspectives with deep historical roots and very real contemporary implications.
Absolutely. At its core, you have Taiwan, a self-governing island, with its own distinct historical trajectory.
Right.
Standing in contrast to the unwavering position of mainland China, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, which insists that Taiwan is and always has been an integral part of Chinese territory.
So our mission in this deep dive, then, is to unpack those layers of history, explore the shifting dynamics, and understand the key actors involved.
Exactly. Drawing on the detailed information we've gathered from our sources.
Okay, so let's start peeling back those layers. Looking at the historical foundations of this one China idea, the material we've reviewed shows Taiwan first came under Chinese Empire administration. Qing dynasty, was it 1684?
That's right, 1684, and then eventually declared an official province in 1885. So, yes, a period of integration.
Okay, integration. But then things changed.
He did. A crucial turning point arrived with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95.
Oh, yeah.
The Treaty of Shimonoseki that followed that conflict ceded Taiwan, then known as Formosa, to the Japanese Empire.
So that direct administrative link was broken. That seems pretty important.
It is important to note, yes, a definite break.
Right. So then we fast forward past World War II into the Chinese Civil War. That feels like another really pivotal chapter.
Undeniably. The victory of the communist forces, Mao Zedong's forces, in 1949 resulted in the retreat of the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek, to Taiwan.
And they set up their government there, still calling it the Republic of China, the ROC.
Precisely. So you had, in effect, two entities claiming to be China, even though internationally recognition shifted over time.
And the KMT's position, based on our sources, was that the ROC had rightfully reclaimed Formosa after Japan's surrender in 45.
Correct. And interestingly, that claim wasn't widely disputed right at the beginning.
So what changed that? What shifted things?
Well, initially, the ROC government on Taiwan did hold China's UN seat and had a fair amount of international recognition, but then the Korean War happened.
Ah, okay. U.S. involvement ramps up.
Significantly. In 1950, President Truman made that statement, saying the occupation of Formosa by communists would be a direct threat to Pacific security and U.S. forces.
And he put the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait, basically blockading it.
He did, preventing an attack. But what's also fascinating, as you mentioned, is Truman explicitly said Taiwan's future status should be determined later.
Right, either by restoring security, a peace treaty with Japan, or UN consideration. It really feels like the seed of that strategic ambiguity we still talk about today.
It does seem to lay the groundwork, yeah. And then, as the Cold War goes on, international alignments start shifting.
Countries started recognizing the PRC, right?
Yeah.
India, European nations.
Exactly. And that movement culminated in a major turning point in 1971.
The UN vote.
Yes. The PRC was admitted to the United Nations, taking over China's permanent seat on the Security Council, the UNSC. That was UN General Assembly Resolution 2058.
And importantly, while that resolution recognized the PRC as the sole legitimate representative of China at the UN, it didn't actually spell out Taiwan's status itself.
That's a key nuance. It expelled Chiang Kai-shek's representatives, but didn't resolve the underlying sovereignty question over Taiwan directly in the text.
Okay, that UN entry seems like a massive shift.
Yeah.
And it happened around the same time as some pretty big moves in U.S. policy, too. Nixon and Mao.
Precisely. The secret talks between Nixon, well, Kissinger mainly, and Mao Zedong led to the Shanghai Communique in 1972.
Right.
And looking at the declassified records, it's quite clear the U.S. signaled they wouldn't support a one China, one Taiwan, or two Chinas policy.
Or Taiwanese independence.
Or Taiwanese independence, correct. It was a major strategic calculation, Cold War context. They wanted to leverage relations with the PRC against the Soviets.
Even if it meant sort of adjusting their stance towards the nationalists on Taiwan, betraying them, some might say.
Some definitely saw it that way. The U.S. essentially acknowledged the PRC's position that Taiwan is part of China.
Acknowledged.
But, crucially, the communique stated the U.S. interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves, leaving it deliberately ambiguous.
So they created this space, this strategic ambiguity. acknowledging Beijing's claim, but not fully endorsing it and insisting on peace.
That's a very good way to put it. And that ambiguity became really the cornerstone of U.S. policy. It was cemented further in 1979 under Carter.
The 1979 Joint Communique, that's when the U.S. formally recognized the PRC.
Yes. Formal recognition of the PRC, establishing full diplomatic relations with Beijing, and simultaneously severing official diplomatic ties with Taiwan, the ROC.
While reaffirming the One China commitment. It sounds like a consistent theme.
It was. And this wasn't just Nixon and Carter. Our sources show the Clinton administration was also very firm on this.
Reaffirming the policy, the three communique.
Exactly. There are reports, apparently, of a confidential letter from President Clinton to PRC President Jiang Zemin in 1995.
What did it say?
Reportedly, it clearly stated the U.S. opposed Taiwan independence, didn't support two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan, and wouldn't back Taiwan joining the UN, the so-called three no's.
Wow. That seems quite explicit behind the scenes. And this line continued under President Bush, too.
Broadly, yes. Maintaining the one China principle, rejecting Taiwanese independence referendums, always emphasizing peaceful resolution.
But even with this consistent diplomatic line on one China, the U.S. kept pushing for Taiwan to be involved in some international bodies, didn't it?
It did. That's one of the inherent contradictions or perhaps balancing acts. The U.S. has repeatedly advocated for Taiwan's participation, as an observer at least, in organizations like the World Health Organization.
The WHO, right. And China consistently blocks that.
Consistently. Beijing insists Taiwan is just a province and can't participate as if it were a sovereign state. It really highlights the friction within that one China framework.
Okay, so the diplomatic side has this careful ambiguity. But the military side, that seems like a different kind of tightrope walk.
Absolutely. Despite severing formal diplomatic ties, the U.S. commitment to Taiwan's self-defense never really went away. It just shifted form.
How so?
Well, you had the U.S.-ROC Defense Treaty from 1954 and the Formosa Resolution. Those provided a direct security guarantee.
But those ended with normalization with the PRC.
They did. But they were replaced by the Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA, in 1979, passed by Congress.
And the TRA mandates.
It mandates that the U.S. make available defense articles and services necessary for Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. It doesn't guarantee intervention, but it ensures access to arms.
And there have been some major arms sales and military actions over the years that underline this, right? I'm thinking George H.W. Bush selling F-16s in '92.
That was a big one, yes. Caused quite a stir with Beijing. And then Bill Clinton deploying 2 aircraft carrier battle groups near Taiwan during the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis.
Sending a very clear signal.
A very clear signal about U.S. interests in regional stability. And this hasn't stopped. In 2003, the Foreign Relations Authorization Act designated Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally.
Major non-NATO ally. What does that mean, practically?
It facilitates arms sales and defense cooperation. It even authorized active-duty U.S. military personnel to be stationed in Taiwan again for the first time since '79, though in limited roles.
And it really feels like this military support has, well, accelerated recently. Since 2019, maybe?
That's definitely what the sources indicate. The Trump administration approved sales worth over $18 billion.
Wow.
And the Biden administration has continued, announcing sales over $8 billion by early 2024.
What kind of equipment are we talking about?
Significant stuff. Abrams tanks, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, more F-16s, advanced capabilities.
No, there have been reports about delivery backlogs.
Yes, there are acknowledged delays in getting some of this hardware delivered, which is a concern for Taipei. But the commitment to sell is there. Plus, Congress got more involved too.
How so?
Authorizing billions in annual aid to Taiwan in late 2022, grants, loans, direct transfers of equipment.
And it's not just arms sales, is it? We've seen more U.S. Navy ships sailing through the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, the frequency of U.S. naval transits through the strait has increased. It's presented as exercising freedom of navigation, but it's also a clear signal of presence and interest.
Which brings us back to that strategic ambiguity idea. Has that changed?
Officially, no. The U.S. policy hasn't explicitly committed to defending Taiwan if attacked by the PRC. However, President Biden has on multiple occasions answered yes when asked directly if the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily.
But then his team walks it back.
His aides typically clarify afterwards that U.S. policy hasn't changed, that the commitment is still based on the TRA and the One China policy. But the repeated statements certainly muddied the waters at ambiguity.
Meanwhile, Taiwan itself isn't just waiting. They're boosting their own defense spending.
They are. Plans announced to reach 3% of GDP on defense by 2025. They know they need to invest in their own security.
But as you said, it's not just military. The U.S.-Taiwan relationship seems broader now.
Much broader. Since around 2019, we've seen a real uptick in trade, diplomacy, even without formal ties and cultural exchange.
Like the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade.
Exactly. The first agreement under that was signed just recently, December 2024, focusing on things like trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, anti-corruption, practical stuff.
And the economics are significant, aren't they?
Hugely. Taiwan is, the U.S.'s 10th largest export market? Billions of dollars supporting, sources say, over 200,000 American jobs.
And Taiwanese investment in the U.S.
Also growing, reached over $21 billion by 2023. The big one everyone talks about is TSMC.
Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, building massive chip factories in the U.S.
Right. Huge implications for semiconductor supply chains, national security, tech competition. It ties the economies even closer.
And despite no formal diplomatic ties, we've seen high-level U.S. officials visiting Taiwan.
Yes, that's been a noticeable trend. Health Secretary Azar, Undersecretary Crash in 2020, the highest-ranking visit since '79.
Trump lifted some contact restrictions near the end of his term.
He did. And then, of course, Speaker Pelosi's visit in 2022.
Which caused a major reaction from Beijing, military drills, etc.
A very strong reaction, yes. But these visits signal strong bipartisan support in the U.S. for Taiwan. And you have things like the Taipei Act from 2020.
What does that do?
It mandates stronger U.S. advocacy for Taiwan's participation in international organizations and pushes back against countries that undermine Taiwan.
So strengthening unofficial ties across the board, even cultural links.
Definitely. More Taiwanese visitors, more students studying in the U.S., active Fulbright exchanges, and things like the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, the GCTF.
What's that?
It started as a U.S.-Taiwan platform for cooperation on global issues, but now Japan, Australia, Canada are partners too. So it's expanding multilateral cooperation involving Taiwan.
Okay, so a lot of increased U.S.-Taiwan interaction. How does China view all this? Predictably, not well.
Not well at all. Beijing sees these closer ties, the arms sales, the high-level visits, the rhetoric. They see it all as provocative, as undermining the One China principle and encouraging Taiwanese independence.
And Xi Jinping has talked about unification, setting timelines like 2027 as a point of readiness.
That deadline, or target date for PLA readiness, certainly adds pressure and concern. We also have to factor in Taiwan's own politics.
Right, the shift away from the KMT being dominant.
Exactly. The rise of the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. They tend to emphasize a distinct Taiwanese identity, separate from mainland China. Some within the party lean towards independence.
Which is very different from the KMT's traditional stance.
Very different. The KMT historically favored closer ties with the mainland under the framework of One China, though their interpretation differed from Beijing's. Think Ma Ying-jeou's presidency, closer ties, more agreements.
And that brings up the 1992 consensus. That seems like a real point of contention.
It's incredibly ambiguous and contested. The idea is that in 1992, representatives from the CCP and the KMT agreed there was one China, but they could have different interpretations of what that China meant.
PRC versus ROC.
Essentially. But the DPP, especially under President Tsai, has refused to endorse this 1992 consensus, arguing it legitimizes Beijing's claim.
And that refusal really angers Beijing.
It does. Beijing sees it as rejecting the foundation for dialogue, so they've employed various methods to try and influence Taiwan beyond just military pressure.
Like what? Our sources mentioned the United Front strategy.
Yes, the United Front Work Department, the UFWD. It's a major CCP organ focused on influencing groups outside the party, both domestically and internationally.
And its role in Taiwan.
Similar to its work in Hong Kong, trying to co-opt elites, particularly within the KMT and business circles, offering benefits, free trips, building connections, promoting Beijing's narrative.
Even targeting former military and intelligence people.
Sources suggest organizations like the Huangpu Academy Alumni Association have been used to reach out to retired Taiwanese military personnel trying to foster pro-unification sentiment.
Subtle influence campaigns. And then there's the economic leverage. Taiwan relies heavily on trade with the mainland and Hong Kong.
Immensely. Exports to China and Hong Kong are a huge chunk of Taiwan's economy, and Beijing isn't shy about using that as a weapon.
Economic coercion, like what?
We've seen examples. Removing Acer products after a perceived pro-independence statement, targeting specific agricultural exports like Milkfish from southern Taiwan, a DPP stronghold?
Restricting tourism after Tsai's election.
Yes, cutting the number of mainland tourist groups allowed to visit Taiwan, and pressuring international companies, airlines, hotels like Marriott to list Taiwan as part of China on their websites.
Using market access as a political tool.
Precisely. It's designed to punish pro-independence sentiment and reward those seen as more friendly to Beijing.
And this extends into intelligence operations, too.
Oh, yes. The Ministry of State Security, MSS, is active, sometimes through academic fronts like the Institute of Taiwan Studies, and the PLA's intelligence arms like the Second Department.
What are they after?
Espionage, counterintelligence against Taiwan's agencies, gathering political intelligence, and crucially, technological secrets, especially related to defense and high-tech industries.
The sources mention a specific case, Kuo.
Yes, that case illustrates efforts to penetrate Taiwanese intelligence and gather information on U.S.-Taiwan cooperation. There's also the PLA's political warfare units focusing on psychological operations, disinformation, trying to undermine morale, what they call enemy disintegration.
So it's a multi-pronged effort: political influence, economic pressure, intelligence operations, military intimidation.
A comprehensive strategy aimed at preventing formal independence and eventually achieving unification, preferably peacefully, but without ruling out force.
When we step back then, the Taiwan issue seems like a truly fundamental challenge for China, maybe even more sensitive than Hong Kong.
I think that's fair to say. Hong Kong was a handover based on an international treaty. Taiwan is different. It's been self-governing for decades. It's a vibrant democracy.
And that democracy itself might be the core issue for Beijing.
That's a key argument found in the analysis. The success of a democratic Chinese society just across the strait is seen as an implicit challenge to the CCP's authoritarian rule on the mainland, the fear of a potential domino effect.
So China uses its economic weight, its military buildup, the ambiguity of U.S. support, all tools to manage this perceived threat and push towards unification.
While Taiwan faces the challenge of maintaining its de facto independence and democratic system against this immense pressure.
And the future seems uncertain.
Yeah.
Especially with potential shifts in U.S. policy. You mentioned President-elect Trump's 2025 comments.
Yes, his remarks about Taiwan potentially having to pay for U.S. defense introduced a note of uncertainty, questioning the long-standing, though ambiguous, U.S. commitment, despite the relative continuity across previous administrations. It adds another variable to an already complex equation.
It really underscores the incredibly delicate balancing act. The U.S., Taiwan, China, all navigating this very sensitive, long-standing issue with a constant potential for things to escalate.
A very precarious balance indeed.
So, just to wrap up this deep dive, we've traced the history back to the Qing dynasty, seen how the post-Civil War reality and Cold War politics shaped the One China policy and U.S. strategic ambiguity.
We've looked at how U.S. policy evolved, especially the shift with Nixon and Carter, leading to formal recognition of the PRC, but maintaining unofficial ties and defense support for Taiwan through the TRA.
And we've seen how those U.S.-Taiwan ties have deepened recently, militarily, economically, diplomatically, culturally, despite the lack of formal relations.
Alongside that, we explored China's perspective, its view of these ties as provocative, and its multifaceted strategy using the United Front, economic coercion, and intelligence operations to influence Taiwan and push for unification.
It really does go far beyond the headlines, doesn't it? Touching on fundamental questions of sovereignty, democracy versus authoritarianism, and global power shifts.
Absolutely. It's one of the world's most complex and potentially volatile geopolitical issues.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given how intertwined the global economy is, especially in tech supply chains involving Taiwan, and given the constant military signaling in the region, what unforeseen factors, maybe things outside the direct control of Washington, Beijing, or Taipei, might ultimately tip the scales and determine the future of Taiwan and the One China policy? Something to ponder.
Definitely something to keep watching. We encourage you to keep exploring this, keep considering all the different angles.